Question 1A. Identify an ideology that shaped one media narrative that you have studied this year. So this should be pretty straightforward. Make sure you identify the narrative, including the year and director, and then an ideology such as feminism or gender roles or something along those lines. Question 1B. Describe how the ideology identified in Part A shaped this media narrative. So whatever we've chosen as our ideology and our narrative, we have to consider how this might be have been constructed in the film. So things like character conflicts or relationships between characters, even things like location or the plot lines, that sort of thing would be worth talking about here. Question 2. The characteristics and construction of a media narrative are dependent on its media form. Describe one characteristic of a media narrative in the media form that you've studied this year. So choose one narrative, make sure you check that it's not locking you into something you don't want to talk about. For the next question, our media form should be film or moving image film, and our discussion should revolve around what makes the construction of this unique. So things like the narrative structure, such as opening, development, resolution. We may have our opening, which would describe or establish our setting, location, characters. We would talk about the rising action in Act 2, the development of our characters, the conflicts and so on, and our climax and resolution. We could also talk about the way codes have been used to uniquely construct this particular media form as well. But for this question, I would probably speak about that first one. Question 3. Analyse the function of two media codes and or conventions used to convey meaning in one media narrative that you have studied this year. So we should be choosing two codes, two conventions, or one code and one convention, and we should be discussing that with respect to a particular meaning that's constructed through their combination. So things like a particular scene, maybe the opening sequence, the climax or the resolution, and discuss that with respect to two of those codes and or conventions. With this question, just make sure that it is an analyse question, so you do need to describe each of these scenes in a little bit of detail by describing the use of codes and conventions. Of course, that's the question. Question 4. Ideologies in society frame the nature, form and structure of media narratives. Analyse the relationship between one media narrative and the ideological context of its production. In your response, refer to a media narrative that you've studied this year and that has been released within the last 5 years. Of course, we're going to have to choose waves for this one. Make sure we identify waves, Tradewood-Schultz 2019. And we have to then talk about context. So we do need to reference contemporary ideological context in society and how that might relate to the actual production itself. So that means how it's produced, the shooting, the decisions made during production. In other words, the codes and conventions, the use of different technical and symbolic codes in the construction of our characters, in our conflicts, in our narrative structure and resolution and the like. Question 5. Explain how a structural and or aesthetic quality that was evident in one or more media products that you investigated in the development stage of your media production design could be read by audiences. Your development stage was your research and your experiments. And importantly, we need to discuss how these were read by audiences. So you would want to look at maybe your practitioners that you investigated. If you're talking about structural qualities, really good thing to do is talk about the structural quality of short films, because that is important in your development of a short film concept. And aesthetic qualities, maybe the use of colour or particular style that practitioner employed that was unique to them. And then again, always remember to read the rest of the question and embed that reading by audiences. Question 6. A feature common to production designs across media forms is a clear understanding of the proposed audiences. Explain how you plan to engage your proposed audience through the use of one media code or convention in your media production design. So media production design is your intention, and everything from your intention basically to your pre-production documentation such as storyboards and mock-ups. And importantly, you do need to describe your proposed audience. So please make reference to that and be specific. Just talking about teenagers is not enough. You also need to talk about their interests, something a little bit more elaborate than just their age or something like that. It is important that you discuss how media codes and or conventions would engage that audience, and engagement is making a connection emotionally with that audience, maybe connecting with something culturally to that audience. That's an important characteristic. Question 7A. Outline the methods that you use to document the development of your media product during production and post-production. Don't get tripped up on the word development. It's the development of your product during production and post-production. So please make sure you identify something that you did during production and post-production, not something you did after production and post-production. So things like editing journals, vlogs, any kind of documentation associated with the production. It might be annotating shot lists, it might be annotating the script or rewriting the script or whatever it may be. Just make sure it's happening during production and post-production. 2-mark question. Question 7B. Describe how effectively the method outlined in Part A helped you realise and or refine your media product. So, realise and refine. Realise is the actual execution of your product as intended, and refine is basically making those minor adjustments and changes to tweak your product, such as things like adjusting the pacing of your editing, or colour grading, or tweaking the audio balance, J&L cuts and that sort of thing. But describe how effectively the method outlined. So we need to identify how it was used and describe how it helped you achieve the realisation and refinement of your product. Just remember all of these elements of this question. Question 8. Describe one challenge for the Australian government in regulating the use of media product by Australian audiences. So this is an interesting question. It's an Australian audience question. So we have to think about an existing government regulation, and we have to identify a weakness of that. The most obvious way to respond to this question is to talk about the prevalence of online streaming or video on demand platforms such as YouTube and Netflix, and the inability for Australian government classification board to employ the National Classification Scheme to adequately regulate that content. Question 9. How have media institutions been affected by the agency that contemporary media users now exercise? Please make sure you are talking about contemporary media users, so modern examples. So embed a modern case study in this response, such as something like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And we want to talk about how audiences use their agency to impact or influence institutions. In this case, it was Netflix and NBC. What we also want to do is we want to talk a little bit about maybe some communication theories like uses and gratification, or the idea of spreadability. Always good to embed that to add that level of sophistication to your response. Question 10. Today, the media not only produces and distributes content to audiences, it also generates and sustains social networks, which have in turn enabled new modes of production, distribution, consumption, and reception based on the sharing of commercial and user-generated content. That is not the question, but it's obviously referring to social media, so we need to make sure we're referencing that. Analyse one example of how the use of media by globalised media institutions has had an impact on the dynamic and changing relationship between media and its audience. So, lots to talk about here. We need to talk about globalised media institutions such as YouTube or Netflix, and then talk a little bit about how algorithms are used to try and engage audiences and recommend content. We might also talk a little bit about live streaming, the trust in social media networks, parasocial relationships, things like binge watching, geo-blocking, this idea of pseudo-agency within filter bubbles, and media influences and advertising. Question 11. Discuss the capacity of the media to influence its audiences in a contemporary media landscape. So we have to use a contemporary example here. So influence means changing audience behaviour. This is the idea that we've got to focus on a case study that might reference that, and then of course embed some communication theories or a communication theory to support that. So something like violent video games could be a good one to talk about, but when we're talking about capacity of media to influence, and it's a discussed question, we really need to balance that with a less definitive response. So we might want to include a however, or discuss include it is debatable to the extent to which violent video games influence violent behaviour. We want to include a however in there. Please do not discuss old case studies. Section B, question 1. Discuss the relationship between one media narrative that you've studied this year and its audiences. In your response, refer to how the audiences engage with and read the media narrative. Importantly, make sure you get to the bottom or the back of the exam and look at the assessment criteria. There are things in here that aren't asking the question, such as media codes and conventions. Maybe at the very beginning of writing time, you just make a quick note of that at the top of the margin here. And make sure you are discussing audience engagement, how do they emotionally connect with the film, and reading, how do they understand the film. You could support that with evidence such as reviews. You could support that with examples of meaning attached to particular scenes or the narrative resolution or the characters, and we want to bring in potentially some ideological references here too, because that will change the meaning that audiences read from a narrative. Section B, question 2, evaluate the extent to which one or more ethical or legal issues have an impact on the consumption of media products. So choose an ethical or multiple ethical issues or legal issues, and then we need to talk about the consumption. So again, go to the back of the exam, look at the assessment criteria, make sure you're covering everything there right in the margins before you start your response. The extent, evaluate the extent. So we do need to provide statistical evidence, and we need to include a debate of some description, however of some description, following our supporting evidence. We might want to include things like intellectual property, this idea around data aggregation. We could talk about advertising on social media. We could look at issues surrounding self-regulation and enforcing laws across boundaries, national boundaries. We could talk about piracy, copyright, all of these sorts of things.